Slavery is embedded in the DNA of the nation in such a way that it cannot be separated out. We have a saying here that Africa has history without Brazil, but Brazil has no history without Africans. Rio de Janeiro was the touch point of the Portuguese entering into Brazil. It was the political capital, it was the economic capital, it's where policy was set, it's where business was done, and it's where the big ships arrived. When we talk about slavery, our minds go to agriculture. That's all very well and true, but in Rio de Janeiro, half of the city was enslaved. And that constitutes the largest urban slave population since the Roman Empire. Enslaved Africans were working at every level. There were high status, highly educated, highly competent enslaved Africans who were working to literally build this city. So when we look at some of these old, beautiful buildings in the city, those were engineered by enslaved Africans. Praça Chintz is a very important point. This was the first entry into Brazil. So we have here the Paço Imperial, the Imperial Palace. So here we have a representation of the state, a representation of the crown. And then if we look directly across the plaza, then we see the church. The authority of the church cannot be separated from the Portuguese colonization project. It was the Catholic Church that gave power to the crown in Portugal. And then from the crown of Portugal, land concessions were given in Brazil. So this was a missionary project as much as a colonization project. And then here in this building is the stock market. This is the bank. This is the economic foundation. And so it was along this street where the original slave market stood. So what we have is Africans are being trafficked through this portal, through this doorway, and that door is framed by the state, the church, and the bank. And they pass through this portal, and what happens then becomes Brazil. The arrival is in this location. And so what we have is that Africans are being captured in the interior of the continent, then they're trafficked to the coast, and then cross the ocean. Millions of them perished in the sea in the crossing. Many of them didn't survive much longer after disembarking. So we had then this accumulation of dead bodies that were just piled in the streets. So there were one of the first kind of logistical problems in building the city was what to do with the bodies. So we have a capital city that's beginning to grow with this traffic going on right in the middle of that city. And so the abolitionist movement, which is operating out of the Black Church, they're putting pressure on the Imperial Palace, on the second viceroy, to end the slave trade. But in the end, the empire is so dependent on the wealth that's being generated from the African slave trade that he acquiesces in the end. He does not shut down the slave trade, but he moves it to a part of the city that at the time was very remote. You can see that the water line is in the distance, but there's just a small inlet that creeps up here, and this is where the Valongo is located. So the big ships drop anchor a little bit back in the deeper water. And then the captives, the Africans, they are transferred onto smaller boats. And then those smaller boats come in here and they disembark at this wharf. So you have this little wharf here where the small boats came up, and then the merchandise, African people, were then moved into a warehouse that was built here. And this would be how we understand wholesale. In 1996, a young couple wanted to expand their house. They started to dig in the backyard to put an addition onto the house. And the bones started to come up. And then there were more bones. And then they were obviously human bones. So they called the authorities, and the archaeologists came and did the survey and determined that this was the location of the old cemetery of the New Blacks. Where we are standing is the largest known to date slave cemetery in all of the Americas. There are an estimated 30 to 40,000 souls interred here in this space. This was intended to be a cemetery. So the first burials here were proper burials, but there were so many bodies that the place very quickly first became a mass grave where bodies were dumped, and then became a trash dump where local residents would throw old foodstuffs, old pottery, they threw away their trash. So the fact that this became a trash dump to the local population tells us a great deal about Rio de Janeiro society at the time. What awaited Africans who arrived in Rio de Janeiro was a life expectancy, depending on where you ended up in Brazil and what kind of work you were made to do, could have been either an average of 4 years or 7 years. So what happens is that the Portuguese and the Brazilians create a labor system where labor is literally disposable. There was absolutely no incentive for those people who were classified as the master to invest even minimally in minimal conditions of food, clothing, shelter, medicine, because these ports, as we described them earlier, there were just ships coming every day. There was more. So it becomes more economically interesting to those people designated as master to work them to death and go buy another one. Brazil was the last country to formally end chattel slavery, and that was in 1888. And that was done by a proclamation called the Golden Law, the Lei Áurea, which was read out by the Princess Isabel. And the problem with it was that it was simply that. It was a declaration. She declared the end of slavery, the definitive end of slavery in all of its forms in Brazil. Then what? People had no place to go. They had no land. They had no tools. So what we see very soon in the years after abolition is the reconstitution of asymmetrical relationships. And those asymmetrical relationships are then reproduced through the years and through the generations until we see them until today.